During this last week, a child was among those who drowned trying to make the crossing from mainland Europe to the UK. And it's really hard to contemplate that experience for that child. Today we're going to take a look at these two incidents of Jesus at the temple in Jerusalem. That particular journey was not that hazardous. Jesus did some other journeys that were. So in the first instance, assuming the journey was from Bethlehem, it was only a day's walk away, well, there and back in a day actually. But from Nazareth, a lot longer. 5 days each way would be a reasonable guess for that journey. And the journey was made in the company of others. And making the journey not to find a new home, but with the hope that God is going to change their home, with the hope that Messiah will come and Messiah will begin a new era and new things will happen and people will look out for one another and people will become aware of the right way to live upon the earth. And that remains our hope as the Christian church, putting our faith in that Messiah, Jesus. This week, we look not at the journeys themselves or the hazards thereof, but at the place where the journey would take them to, the temple in Jerusalem. Luke is keen for us to know, I think, that though he's not going to tell us much detail of Jesus's life as a child, for 30 years we just don't know much, and that signals that there's not much to know in one sense. But he wants us to feel this devout background, that Jesus may have challenged the religious authorities of his time, but he did so from within the faith. He did so as a devout person who had always grown up in the rhythms and the patterns of constant attention to being part of the community of faith. So it's that community of faith that he was part of in his local synagogue, week by week, just as Christians normally meet together in fellowships week by week. And then perhaps for Jesus once a year, so not very often. He's 12 and then later on, it's 30 by the time he starts his ministry. So he goes up to the temple, and that's a very big feature of his devout upbringing. And of course, I think Luke will want us to grasp that he's showing us that Jesus brings in something new, but it comes out of the old, that he's thoroughly immersed and part of the Old Testament faith, if I could put it in our terms now. He's going to bring in a new testament, a new covenant, a new relationship with God, a new way of being devout. But it's not that he's breaking with it, he's completing it from within. And I think that's part of Luke's method. Anyway, we haven't time to go into it very much. Instead, I'd like to share really on that second visit to the temple when Jesus stays behind and his parents return. So the background, as I indicated in the reading, is the place of the temple as the only point on the planet where valid sacrifice could be made, and valid sacrifice must be made, and any devout person must be associated with that. So going to Jerusalem, really, really important. And just noticing the time in Jesus's life that this is. So the very first instance, he's about 6 weeks old. So he's passive, if you like. We see Jesus doesn't say anything, doesn't do anything in the first thing. You'll need to read for yourself, verse 22 onwards. But sort of people pass him around and so on, as you do with babies. He's passive. He doesn't have anything to say or anything to do. It's what happens to him. But when we come to him as a 12-year-old, he's at the recognized threshold, the border between childhood and maturity. And at 12, he's expected to start this transition from childhood into adult life. And he's the oldest son. And therefore, part of the expectation is that he will now begin, as a 12-year-old going on into his teens, he will begin to take on the business of Joseph, the carpenter. So he'll become a carpenter. He'll work alongside dad, learn the trade and serve the trade and so forth. He will have already been doing that for years anyway, but now he'll be doing it much more, if you like, as an apprentice might. He's learning because at any time he could need to take over. And in fact, Joseph does disappear from the scene before Jesus is 30. So he's there about his father's business. He's there, he's the oldest son. In the absence of his dad, for any reason, he becomes the responsible person. And at 12, he's learning to do that and to think for himself. And one of the things that as a becoming adult, he's required to do in their culture is to make his own decision, to make his way to Jerusalem, to be there not just because he's taken, but now because he is coming of age enough to take himself, that he's going to take increasing responsibility for living his faith and lean less on Joseph and Mary. So that's the kind of scene we have. A mass pilgrimage, hundreds of people from his area, from Galilee, probably thousands, on the road to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. His own community travelling tight-knit together, people who know each other and live together in a very close community, travelling together and then returning home afterwards. And he ends up staying behind. I think it's important just to clear up our minds on a couple of things. I don't think anybody does anything wrong. Okay, there is a family row. There's a misunderstanding for sure. But I don't think it's because anybody's done anything wrong. See, Mary and Joseph haven't done anything wrong. If parents in the life of my faith community had not known where their 12-year-old was on a trip for a period of into the second day, however long exactly that would have been, but 12 hours and more, for me that would be a safeguarding issue. In their culture and the way they operated, there was no issue of parental neglect here at all. They move as relatives and community together in a solid group. And Jesus is now expected to move as part of that group with an increasing independence. It's not total yet. He's only 12 and he's still called the boy Jesus. But this process of the borderline into adulthood has begun. And so Mary and Joseph have not been neglectful, I don't think. And they return to Jerusalem to find him. But when they do, anxious parent syndrome kicks in and they chastise him, at least Mary does. And he seems puzzled by the argument. He genuinely, she's sure he's done wrong. And he thinks that she ought to be understanding that the very things they've been bringing up to do, he's now doing. And so that's why I prefer the translation, not in my father's house. I see why that makes sense, but I prefer it's a slightly more literal translation to say about the things of my father, about the business, the affairs that my father sees to, which in the way they had of talking, your household and your business, it's all one thing. You talk about the life of the household, it's the same thing as about talking about the father of the household's affairs and business and so So being in the Father's house and being about your Father's business is interchangeable. I just have my preference. So we have this family argument, stand up, rouse, quite short, in the temple courts, where people have been amazed at the answers and responses and questions that show a very remarkable wisdom at work in this 12-year-old. People are taking notice. Something is stirring now. In the introduction to the reading, I suggested, Jesus didn't turn up at school and do miracles in the lunch break or feed 5,000, at break time or something. That's not what the infant life and the childhood of Jesus was like. And indeed, as he went on into adulthood, there's nothing further said about him between age 12 and age 30. And the value of this is it underscores for us that the incarnation is real. That when the scripture talks to us about God coming into human life in Jesus Christ, it's a real human life. It's not an imaginary one filled with magical moments. It's a real, day-by-day, grief-filled, hard-working, devout, normal, godly life for his culture and time. So that's what's going on. Jesus isn't God floating through a childhood without touching childhood in reality. He touches all of what it is to be human, just as we touch everything that it is to be human, from birth to death and through the stages of growth. And Luke twice uses references here to the development, the personal and spiritual development of Jesus. He didn't come ready wrapped, if you see what I mean, and fully loaded. He came and needed to grow up, needed to develop spiritually, needed to develop in his understanding of himself and of Scripture. By the way, Luke's last comment on the development of Jesus is a direct quote from the childhood of the Old Testament prophet Samuel. And I think the hint is that Jesus' self-understanding and why he stayed behind when others have left is actually partly based on discovering himself through reading the Old Testament and discovering his ministry through the ministries of the prophets and so on. That's what I suspect is going on, but let me not go too far down there. I'm saying that nobody does wrong. Jesus doesn't do wrong here. Mary doesn't do wrong. Joseph doesn't do wrong. The teachers of the law in the temple don't do wrong. The people who notice it all don't do wrong. But there's still a misunderstanding. There's a tension, you see, between the infancy and the grown-up versions of Jesus. And every household that's been through this stage of life knows that as the child becomes adolescent and starts to take on adult nature, tensions tend to happen. And they don't always happen because somebody's being wrong. It's just adjusting to the realities of human life. Here's the lesson that I want myself to learn, and I'll share it with you. Mary and Joseph and me are more comfortable with baby Jesus than we are with grown-up Jesus. Mary, Joseph and me like a cozier scene. We like the Christmas story. We like a manger because a manger can be cozy. We don't like a cross because a cross is about suffering and death. It's about what can happen in the middle of the English Channel to a child of a migrant family. The cross is about human pain and distress and our separation from God and the state the world's in and all those uncomfortable things. Much better to have a baby Jesus who you can put where you need him, bring him out when you want him, who may cry sometimes and keep you awake, but for the most part, you're in control. The adult Jesus calls me to follow him. The baby doesn't. And so what I need to do is grow up in my faith and follow a grown-up Jesus. And if I celebrate his birth at Christmas, which I will be doing, not leave him as baby Jesus and then go into another year as baby Jesus, but actually let him grow in stature, in wisdom, in spiritual understanding, in favour with God and with people, and let him be the real grown-up adult Jesus who doesn't leave me all comfortable with my life, but challenges me at every point and constantly says to me, it's time for you to stop putting me where you want me and for you to follow me. And that, by the way, is the very gateway to freedom itself. Anyway, enough for 1 week. God bless you. Keep you safe this week.